אנחנו מוצאים את הפורום זרה שמשון.
האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה? מה? כן.
Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Shoftim. We're doing Os Hey, section 5. It's a short piece. However, it's packed with a lot of things that we're going to need to unravel. So before we begin this piece, there are a couple of concepts that we need to talk about, to discuss. The first one is the concept of Eidim Zomimim, which are mentioned in our Parsha, in Parsha Shoftim. And basically, in a nutshell, the case of Eidim Zomimim is as follows. If you have witnesses who come and testify against a person, and then a second set of witnesses come, and they testify that the first set of witnesses were not could not possibly be telling the truth about what they said they saw, because they were in an entirely different place, different location at the time that they claimed to witness the incident that they said they witnessed. So then the Torah teaches us that the second pair of witnesses, their testimony is accepted. Obviously, the court goes through its process of verifying the testimony of the witnesses with questions and methods and procedures that the Beis Din follows. But we accept the testimony of the second set of witnesses who say that the first set of witnesses were not even present, could not have been there, and we then give the punishment to that set of witnesses that their testimony would have caused to take place, to happen to the person they were testifying against. So let's just give a simple example. Imagine that witnesses come to the court and they testify that a person, Joe, killed another person. They say, we saw Joe kill Jim. And they answer and they say that they warned him, and they do all the things that would have been required for witnesses to say to result in the execution of Joe, right? So they testify against him, and the court accepts their testimony, and the court is prepared to execute Joe. Then a new set of witnesses comes in and says about those witnesses, no, they were with us far, far away. They couldn't possibly have seen what they said they saw. They couldn't have seen the murder. They didn't see Joe. They weren't in that location. So the Beis Din puts to death, executes the two witnesses because their testimony, their false testimony, would have resulted in the death and the execution of an innocent man. And so they are executed. That's the law of Eidim Zomimim, really very much in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it. Actually, as we'll see, some of the other information in this piece, some of the details will be in this piece, but there are many other details. But that's the basic concept of Eidim Zomimim. The next thing we need to talk about before we begin is a famous argument between Chazal, between the rabbis of the sages of the Mishnah, and the Tzedokim, the Sadducees. The Tzedokim were a sect, a group of Jews who lived during the period of the Bayis Sheni, of the Second Temple, and they had many different beliefs, but their most fundamental disagreement with the rabbis, with our rabbis, with Chazal, was that they only accepted the Torah. They claimed that only the written law came from Hashem. They didn't accept the oral tradition. They didn't accept the Torah Shebal Peh. And of course, our entire understanding of Judaism and halacha and how we practice and what we do is based on an acceptance of both the Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, Tanakh, and also the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition that we believe was passed down at Har Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu, and from Moshe Aaron and the Zakanim and ultimately to Yehoshua and to all subsequent leaders of the people, and passed down to our own time in a written form as the core of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Sadducees, because of their viewpoint, they disagreed about many topics, and one of them was one of the rules of Eidim Zomamim, the case that we just described, the situation that we just described a moment ago. The Sadducees said and held as a strong opinion that Eidim Zomamim should only be punished if the consequence that they were trying to have happen to the person they testified against actually happened. So going back for a moment to our case of Joe, when the witnesses testified against him that they saw him kill someone, the Sadducees, the Tzedokim, held that only if the Bezdin went and then executed Joe would the witnesses receive the punishment of execution. However, if the court did not execute Joe, and before they executed Joe, the second set of witnesses came and said, no, these guys weren't even there, they couldn't have seen what they said they saw, then those witnesses would not be executed because their testimony did not result in the death and the execution of an innocent man. They tried to accomplish that, but since they didn't do it, the Tzedokim held that then they could not be punished. However, Chazal, our sages teach us the opposite, and they say that it is only in a case where the man was not executed, where Joe was not executed, that the witnesses suffer the penalty of execution, of death. They suffer the penalty of capital punishment. However, if the court put the man to death, let's say in our case, they put Joe to death because of the testimony of the first set of witnesses, and then a second set came and said they weren't there, they were with us in a whole different place, then we would not put them to death. And that's, of course, is a very, very fundamental disagreement, and we'll see how that plays out in this piece in the Zera Shimshon. So now that we have those two pieces of information hopefully firmly in our heads, let's take a look at two psukim from the parsha and then we'll get right into the piece itself. This is Parsha Shoftim Perak Yud Tes, psukim Yud Ches and Yud Tes. It's going to be one of the sources of the law of Eidim Zomamim. V'darshu hashoftim heitev, and the judges should inquire into the case well. V'hine eid sheker ha'eid, and behold, if the witnesses who testified are false, sheker ono ve'achiv, and they answered with false testimony against their brother. So that pasuk is referring to the case we said where a pair of witnesses come in and testify falsely about, in the case we used, the example we used about a murder. So the Bezdin establishes through the testimony of the second set of witnesses that the first set testified falsely. The next pasuk says, "Va'asisem lo ka'asher zamam." Then you should do to the witness, but we understand it means both witnesses. You should do to the pair of false witnesses according to that which they conspired to do, le'achiv, to their brother, to the innocent man. Uvi'arta hara mikirbecha, and you should wipe out the evil from among you. In other words, by imposing capital punishment against these witnesses who did such a terrible thing as give false testimony that would have resulted in the execution of an innocent man, by then executing those witnesses, the Torah's hope is and the Torah's goal is that type of thing will cease. It will be removed from among the Jewish people, because everyone will realize if they ever have such a sinister thought as to give false testimony that could lead to an innocent person's execution, they'll realize that could lead to their own death. Those witnesses could be executed by the Bezdin instead of the innocent man, and so therefore, hopefully, they will refrain from giving the false testimony. Now let's get into the piece. Oshe, section 5, V'asisem lo ka'asher zomam. This comes, of course, from the pasuk, one of the two psukim we just read. And you should do to them according to what they conspired to do, meaning give them the punishment that they try to inflict upon their innocent victim, upon an innocent person. Perish Rashi. Rashi explains, Ka'asher zomam, as they conspired to do, velo ka'asher osa, and not as they did. Rashi points out that the pasuk could have said, do to the witnesses what they did, punish them according to the punishment that they caused to happen to an innocent person. But the Torah does not say that. The Torah says, do to them according to what they planned and conspired to do, but not what they actually did. Mikan Amru, from here, the Chazal said, Hargu, if the witnesses actually killed a man, if their testimony actually resulted in the death of an innocent man, ein neherogin, then they are not put to death. And we mentioned this before, that one of the halachos of Eidim Zomamim is that they are only put to death if their victim was not put to death. However, if the victim that they conspired against and testified against was executed, then they are not executed. Although that might seem counterintuitive, we'll talk at the end about the explanation that's given for that. But right now, we're just going with Rashi's explanation on the pasuk. V'chosav ha-Livyas Chain, and in the commentary of Livyas Chain, he wrote, Tema. This is hard to understand. This Rashi is hard to understand. Ki lo nimtza l'razal, because we do not find amongst the statements of Razal, of our Rabbonim, Zichronim Levracha, that means Chazal, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, we don't find B'shum Makom in any place she'amru zeh, that they said this teaching, namely the teaching that the Eidim Zomam and the conspiring witnesses are only put to death if their intended victim was not executed. We don't find that statement made min ka'asher zomam velo ka'asher osa, from based on the inference that Rashi, the drasha, the interpretation that Rashi just stated of ka'asher zomam as they planned to do velo ka'asher osa, and not as they actually did. That's not the source that Livyas Chain argues. Ella, but rather there's a different source brought down, B'Mishnah B'Perakama D'Makos, and it's brought down in a Mishnah in the first parak of Meseches Makos. Hachi Issa, and this is what the Mishnah states. Ein ha'edim zomamin v'chule. These conspiring witnesses are not put to death. And then the Zera Shimshon leaves out a few words, and what it says is, unless the Eidim Zomim are not put to death, unless there was a Gemar Din, unless the Bezdin listened to their testimony and issued a verdict of execution against the person, the man that they testified against the defendant in the case. Not if that man was executed, but rather if a verdict was issued by Bezdin based on the testimony of the witnesses, the Mishnah says, then those witnesses will suffer the punishment that they conspired to give to the innocent, to their innocent victim, to the innocent defendant. V'halo v'chule. And then the Mishnah continues and it says, but don't we have a pasuk that says nefesh tachas nefesh, that you only kill a person if he actually killed someone, and then it continues to say, it brings in a pasuk of la'asos le'achiv, that's our pasuk, that they intended to do something to their brother, v'harei achiv kayom. And the Mishnah states, and their brother, the defendant in the case, is still alive. The pasuk implies that he's still alive. And if he's still alive, that should teach us that you only do the punishment to the witnesses if their intended victim was not executed, if he's still alive. However, if he was executed, then the witnesses are not killed, as we stated above. Upirish Rashi, and Rashi explains on that Mishnah in Makos, Lasos le'achiv, the pasuk says they conspire to do it to their brother, meaning to the victim, to the defendant. Sorry, Mashma. This teaches us she'achiv adayin kayam. Mentioning of the brother in this way implies that the brother is still alive. And so the Livyas Chaim's question is that if we simply look at the Mishnah in Maseches Makos, we'll see the correct source for the law about the Eidim Zomamim, and it comes from the words Lasos le'achiv. It does not come from the words of Ka'asher Zomam, as Rashi argued. So let us continue. Umikoach kushyazo, and from the strength of this question, meaning the Livyas Chaim says, I have a pretty strong question here because Rashi's commentary on Chumash seems to clearly contradict a Mishnah in Maseches Makos. Well, Rashi can't really do that usually. So from the strength of this question, Tirates ve'he'eleh, the Livyas Chaim answers and concludes de'efsher lilmod zeh mika'asher zomam, that it is impossible to learn this ruling about the Eidim Zomamim from the words ka'asher zomam, as Rashi did in his commentary on Chumash. That is impossible to be correct. Ella mila achiv, but rather this ruling about Eidim Zomamim can only be learned from the word le'achiv, implying that the brother, meaning the person they testified against, is still alive, as the Mishnah in Makos states. So let's pause here to make sure we understand what's happening. There is no disagreement between Rashi and the Livyas Chaim, or for that matter, any of the authentic Jewish sources, meaning putting aside the Tzedokim, putting aside the heretical sect and group called the Tzedokim, the Sadducees. Putting that aside, there's no valid opinion within Chazal that says that we should only kill the conspiring witnesses if their testimony resulted in the death of the innocent man they were conspiring against. No one says that. Rashi and Livyas Chaim both agree, based on teachings in Chazal, that in fact, if the defendant was executed, then the Eidim Zomamim, then conspiring witnesses are not executed. They are only executed if their testimony resulted in a verdict of guilty, a guilty verdict against the man they testified against, but the verdict was not carried out. In such a case, the Eidim Zomamim and the conspiring witnesses receive the exact same punishment that they tried to give to the defendant, who was in fact found guilty based on their testimony, but the sentence was not yet carried out. So that they both agree to that. What Rashi and Livyas Chaim are disagreeing about is, what is the source for that? Rashi in his commentary on Chumash says the source for that comes right from the two psukim we read, from the words ka'asher zomam, and Rashi said the pasuk is saying it's according to what they planned to do, the lo ka'asher asa, and not what they actually did, meaning the verdict wasn't actually carried out. Just only the man was convicted, but the verdict had not yet been carried out when we found out that the witnesses had testified falsely. That's what Rashi says. Livyas Chaim, based on the Mishnah in Masechta Makos, which seems to be pretty clear, says, no, those are the wrong words to focus on. The drasha, the learning, comes out from the words lasos le'achiv. They conspired to do this to their brother, and that implies that the brother is still alive, and that means he wasn't executed. And that's where we learn that had he been executed, the Eidim Zomamim and the conspiring witnesses would not in fact be punished, would not be executed. They only get executed if they conspired against the man and they caused a guilty verdict to be issued against him, but not for the verdict to be carried out. So it's important to understand that everyone agrees to that idea. Rashi and Livyas Chaim are just disagreeing about the source for that law. And now the Zera Shimshon is going to come to Rashi's defense. As we've seen in the past, the Zera Shimshon is never comfortable when later authorities argue with earlier authorities, and the Livyas Chaim was a later authority, and Rashi was, of course, an early member of the Rishonim. He lived in the 11th century, which is close to the beginning of the period of the Rishonim, and so Zera Shimshon comes to Rashi's defense. Ve'adar Rabbah. And it's just the opposite. Nira lehefech. It seems, it appears that the opposite is correct. She'efshar lilmod zeh mila'achid. It's actually impossible to learn this law about Eidim Zomim and conspiring witnesses from the pasuk of, from the words in the pasuk of le'achiv, to his brother, which is the Livyas Chaim's opinion. Zera Shimshon says that cannot possibly be correct. Why not? Shaharei le'achiv, because the word le'achiv in the pasuk itzterich, it is needed ledrasha achariti, for an entirely different learning or interpretation. As we say at the end of the parak of Hanechenokin in Maseches Sanhedrin, we're now at the top of the neck of the second column. As it says over there, from the word le'achiv, which means again to his brother, Gamrinon, we learn shezomeme bas kohen heim enom bisreifa. Witnesses who conspired against the daughter of a Kohen, and they testified that they saw that she committed adultery with a man, of course, who was not her husband, with a man that she was not married to. So this is a daughter of a Kohen who is married to a man, okay? She's fully married, and these witnesses come and they testify that they saw her commit adultery with a different man, okay, that she had no reason to be with and to be with in an intimate setting. And they said they testified that she actually committed adultery in the case. Those witnesses, those Eidim Zomim, are not punished with being burned, which would be the punishment of the Bas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen. The Torah states that a daughter of a Kohen who actually does commit adultery, and witnesses come and she's appropriately warned, and she still continues on, and they see her commit adultery, and then they testify in court, and their testimony is verified by the Beis Din. The Torah tells us that Bas Kohen, that daughter of a Kohen, committed adultery, is executed, but she's not given the usual execution for adultery, which is chenek, a type of strangulation, but rather she's given what's considered a worse type of death penalty, and that's the death penalty of shreifa, of burning. However, the witnesses, the conspiring witnesses who testified against an innocent Bas Kohen, who in fact did not commit adultery, but their testimony led to a verdict of guilty against her, and she would have been executed by shreifa, by burning. The witnesses are not, once it's shown that they were false, and they're convicted of being Eidim Zomim and of conspiring, falsely conspiring witnesses, they are executed through chenek, through strangulation, and not through burning. And that teaching comes from the word le'achiv, because we learn out, as the Zera Shimshon continues, de Omar Kra, as the pasuk says, le'achiv, they conspired against their brother, velo la'achoso, and not against their sister, meaning they don't receive the punishment that a woman would receive if it's different than the punishment that a man would receive in that case. Again, even though the punishment that their testimony would have caused the Bas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, to receive would have been shreifa, execution by burning. They are not executed by burning, they meaning the Eidim Zomim, the conspiring witnesses, but rather they are executed by strangulation, chenek, and that teaching is all learned out from the word le'achiv. And so the Zera Shimshon says le'achiv is not available for other drushos, so to speak. You can't use it to learn out something else from. For example, the halacha that the Liv Yaschein wanted to use it for, that you can't do because it's already used to teach us this halacha about how to punish witnesses who falsely testify against a bas kohen. Ve'im kain, and if so, hadin de hargu ein neherogin, the law that we've been talking about, which is if the conspiring witnesses actually, their testimony actually resulted in the death, the execution of the person they testified against, ein neherogin, then they are not killed. That law, efshar tu lemelef le mila achiv. You can no longer suggest learning it from the word le'achiv, because le'achiv is used for the drasha about the burning and the chenek and the strangulation. The al korchach, and against your will, you're compelled to say the nafgalon, that we must learn it out mika'asher zomam, from the words as they planned, which is exactly what Rashi said in his commentary on Chumash. So the Zera Shimshon, if we stopped here, but in a moment you'll see why the Zera Shimshon couldn't stop here, and you might already realize the question he still needs to answer. If we stopped here, the Zera Shimshon would have given a very compelling reason as to why the Liv Yaschein cannot be correct. And that is that the words in the pasuk he wants to use are used to teach a different drasha. And in general, we only use specific words in a pasuk to teach one drasha. We don't use a specific word that can teach us something that the regular pasuk wouldn't teach us, to teach several different drashos. So therefore, Zera Shimshon has supported Rashi at the expense of the Liv Yaschein. However, you might be thinking, as the Zera Shimshon is, wait a minute, the Liv Yaschein didn't say this on his own volition, on his own accord. He said what he said. He argued with Rashi based on a Mishnah in Makos. So how can the Zera Shimshon say that what the Mishnah in Makos said is wrong? That can't be true. You can't say I'm going to choose Rashi over the Mishnah in Makos, right? You can choose Rashi over the Liv Yaschein, a later authority, but you can't choose Rashi over the seemingly very clear words of the Mishnah in Masechta Makos. So now let's go to the last paragraph where the Zera Shimshon resolves that problem and answers that question. Umay disnan beper kama de Makos, and that which we learned in the Mishnah in the first chapter of Maseches Makos, Heim divrei chachamim, those are specific words of the chachamim, sheheshivu latzidokim, that they were responding to the claim of the Sadducees, of the tzedokim, lefi divreihem, according to their words, meaning according to an argument that the tzedokim had put forward in defense of their view, that it's only when the conspiring witnesses succeed in having the person they testified against get executed, only then are the conspiring witnesses executed. As we said before in the very beginning, that was the view of the Tzedokim, of the Sadducees, that Chazal did not accept and totally disagreed with, but that's what the Sadducees said. So the Zera Shimshon says, when you look at the Mishnah in Masechta Makos, you need to read it carefully, and you'll see it talks about the argument between Chazal and the Tzedokim. And in that argument, Chazal made a case based on the Tzedokim's belief and based on their way of interpreting psukim and understanding psukim, not based on the traditional way that Chazal understands psukim, as we'll continue to see right now. Shaharei hatzedokim bevadai lo ya'aminu bedrashas chachomim. The tzedokim would definitely not believe or accept a drasha from the chachomim, meaning if the chachomim had said, the real source for this law, which is the source that Rashi identified, ka'asher zomam velo ka'asher asa, as the witnesses conspired to do, but not as they did. If the Chachamim said, that's our drasha, that is the way, according to the oral law and the oral tradition, that we understand these words, the Tzedokim would never have accepted that, because they didn't accept the oral tradition. They didn't accept the oral law. And the Chachamim, of course, knew that. Shezomame bas kohen lo yiyu b'sreifa. that the witnesses who testify against a Bas Kohen should not be burned, that the Edom Zomamin would not have accepted. Umishum hachi iyatar lehu le'achiv. And because of that, the word le'achiv is actually still available. It's still available according to the Tzedokim to be used for a different learning. Let me pause because I'm realizing I misspoke a few moments ago. I said that the Chachomim couldn't use the drasha of kasher zomam velo kasher osa in arguing with the Tzedokim. That's not what the Zera Shimshon is saying. What the Zera Shimshon is saying is that the Chachomim could not have used the drasha of la'asos le'ochiv. That drasha could not be used, and therefore it is still available. It couldn't be used to teach the law about Sreifa because the Tzedokim would not accept that type of interpretation of the psukim. They didn't accept the oral tradition, as we said. So that means that the word la'achiv is still available. And therefore, the Chachamim said, in speaking to the Tzedokim, you guys need to know that from the word la'asos, le'achiv, to do to the brother, we learn out from that the brother is still alive, and that teaches that the witnesses are only executed if the man they testified against is still alive, meaning if he hasn't yet been executed. If he was executed, then the witnesses are not killed, and that was their way of showing their disagreement with the Tzedokim according to the Tzedokim's own way of understanding psukim and of not using drushos of Chazal, not using oral interpretations. Ula she'ikar haraya hu mikasher zamam. However, putting aside the point that the Chachamim made in the way they argued in the Mishnah in Makos, which was for the benefit of the Tzedokim, and according to their reasoning, putting that aside, the main proof of this halacha that the Edom Zomamin are not killed if their person they testified against has already been executed, that proof comes from the words ka'asher zamam, like the witnesses conspired to do, but not what they actually did, meaning the verdict was not actually carried out. Ukamosha pirush Rashi zichrono levracha, as Rashi explained in his commentary on Chumash. V'chein posak harambam, and this is how the Rambam decides the halacha, meaning this is the source that he uses. Perak Chaf Mehilchos Eidus Halacha Beis, in the 20th chapter of the laws of testimony in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, his book of Jewish law, Halacha Beis, the second halacha of Ayin Sham, and you can look over there to see the Rambam's own language. Okay, so the Zera Shimshon, for what we viewed as a short piece, and we thought it would be short and easy, we realize now that it was short and somewhat complicated because the Zera Shimshon was dealing first with a difference of opinion and a disagreement between Rashi and the Livyas Chaim. Then he had to also deal with the Mishnah in Masechta Makos, which the Livyas Chaim used to support himself. And behind all of this, and really kind of providing the context was all of this, was an ancient argument between Chazal and the Tzedokim that came very much into play in the issues here about Edom Zomamin, about conspiring witnesses. Let's go back now and return to something that we learned, the halach in the very beginning, that the law that the Zera Shimshon told us about Edom Zomamin, which is hargu ein neherogim. If their testimony did result in the death of an innocent person, then they are not killed. And that certainly seems counterintuitive. We would think that if Edom Zomamin, the conspiring witnesses, are executed when their testimony did not result in the death of an innocent individual, if they're executed in that case, which is what the Torah teaches, then certainly they should be executed in a case in which their testimony did lead to the execution of an innocent person, and that is a something that definitely needs to be explained. So the explanation that the Meforshim give is as follows: if a Bezdin listens to evidence against a person, and in the end issues a verdict of guilty, and they execute the person, then from the viewpoint of Chazal, that cannot be viewed as a mistake. That should not be viewed as a mistake. That should be viewed as a situation in which Hashem knew that this person was Chayev Misa, and Hashem arranged things that this person would be killed, would be executed by the Bezdin. And the death of this individual, although based on the specific case in which the false witnesses testified against him, although he was innocent in that case, because as far as we know, the Edom Zomimim were not there and couldn't have given true testimony. Nonetheless, the person, according to the understanding of Chazal, must have done other things for which he was obligated to be executed, and therefore the execution that was carried out is considered a just execution. Again, not based on the details of the specific case of these Edom Zomim, these conspiring witnesses, but based on the general understanding of how the world works and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world according to Chazal. So that is why, if they conspired against him, but he wasn't executed, then they get executed because what they did is such a heinous act that if it wasn't given the most extreme punishment, it could result in the corruption of all the capital cases. People would come and give false testimony, God forbid, in capital cases, and that could lead to complete havoc and the opposite of justice. So they are executed. However, if the man was put to death, then again we understand that it must be that's the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted things to turn out, and the person deserved to be executed for other reasons and other causes. And so we don't put the Edom Zomim to death in that case, similar to a case that the Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about, where if a man has been grievously injured or wounded or is suffering from a clearly fatal disease and is about to die, a person who comes and murders him is not put to death by Bezdin. The Gemara says the victim in that case is considered a bar katola, a person who's already dead, a person who is so close to dying and will definitely die that we do not apply capital punishment to a murderer, even if there are witnesses and warning, there are Edom and Hasra. Nonetheless, the person is not considered a bar kayama, a living person, but rather a dying person, and therefore the person, it's not okay to kill the person. No one's saying it's permissible, but you don't apply capital punishment in that case. And so too over here, we view the ostensibly innocent man who gets executed by the Bezdin. We also view him as a bar katola, as a man who should have been killed. Yashar koach to everyone who participated in learning the Zera Shimshon tonight, and we look forward, God willing, to learning Zera Shimshon again on next week's parsha.